Hi, I'm Mark, and I saw with my own eyes a billionaire and his hand-picked team of engineers laugh at my 10-year-old brother Leo just moments before he saved their entire world. They were standing in front of a silent, multi-million-dollar private jet, a machine that was supposed to be the pinnacle of human engineering, and it was completely dead. The owner's fury was like a storm trapped inside that hangar, but all I could see was the condescending smile on the lead engineer's face as he looked down at my little brother. He didn't see a kid with a rare gift, he saw a nuisance. Little did he know the key to his very expensive problem was standing right in front of him, holding a worn-out notebook. Have you ever felt completely invisible, even when you knew you held the only answer that mattered? Before I tell you how Leo used nothing but his sense of hearing and a faded diagram from a discarded manual to pinpoint a failure that a dozen advanced computers missed, do me a favor. Comment below and let me know where you're watching from, and please subscribe to the channel. Honestly, you are not going to want to miss the look on that billionaire's face when the powerful turbine of his Gulfstream G650 roared back to life, all because of a kid he had dismissed just moments before. The silence that followed that roar was more powerful than any explosion, and it's a moment that deserves to be shared. It's a reminder for anyone who has ever been underestimated. The scene was pure controlled chaos. We were in the private hangar of Mr. Davenport, a man whose name was synonymous with ruthless success. His jet, a Gulfstream G650 that looked more like a spaceship than an airplane, was supposed to be taking him to Geneva to close a deal that would reshape an entire industry. But it wouldn't start. The air was thick with the smell of expensive jet fuel and failure. Davenport was pacing like a caged tiger, his voice a low growl into his phone as he tried to find an alternative. His pilot, a decorated ex-military officer named Captain Rostova, stood stiffly by the cockpit door, her professional pride visibly shattered. And then there were the engineers, flown in by the manufacturer, the supposed Go team, who could fix anything. They were failing, and the pressure was suffocating. And in the middle of all this high-stakes drama was my brother, Leo. At 10 years old, he was supposed to be invisible in a place like this, just the son of the hangars. Maintenance supervisor who was allowed to hang around because he never caused any trouble. He was quiet, always observing, usually with a sketchbook in his hands where he drew complex diagrams of engines and hydraulic systems instead of superheroes. He had this strange intuitive connection with machines. He didn't just understand them, he felt them. He'd spend hours poring over old technical manuals he'd salvaged from the recycling bins, learning how energy flowed, how parts interacted. To these powerful adults, he was just background noise, a kid who didn't belong in their world of certifications and corporate protocols. The Go team was a spectacle of arrogance and incompetence. Dressed in matching jumpsuits with the manufacturer's logo stitched on the chest, they moved with a false sense of authority, plugging in laptops and running diagnostics that spat out meaningless data. They talked in a language of acronyms and technical jargon, designed more to impress than to solve. After 2 hours of this performance, their lead engineer, a man with a permanently skeptical expression, made his grand announcement to Mr. Davenport. He declared a catastrophic internal failure in the starboard engine turbine. The solution? A full engine replacement, a process that would take days, not hours. You could feel the last bit of hope drain from the hangar. For them, the problem was officially unsolvable in the time frame they had. It was in that moment of declared defeat that Leo made his move. He had been standing near the silent engine, not looking at the screens, but listening. He tugged on our dad's sleeve and whispered something, his eyes fixed on the massive turbine. Dad hesitated, then walked over to the lead engineer. I couldn't hear what he said, but the engineer just laughed, a short, sharp, dismissive sound. He glanced at Leo, shook his head, and turned back to his equipment. Please, we're dealing with a multi-million-dollar piece of equipment here, not a toy. Car, he said, loud enough for us all to hear. The kid needs to stay back. The humiliation was a physical thing. It hung in the air, making Leo shrink back, his face burning with a shame that wasn't his to bear. My dad's face was a mask of controlled fury. He saw the flicker of shame in Leo's eyes, the way my brother's shoulders slumped as he tried to make himself smaller, to disappear. For a second, I thought he was going to march over there and say something, but he didn't. He just placed a heavy hand on Leo's shoulder, a silent message of "I'm here, I believe you." That was also a command to stand down. It was the look of a man trapped between defending his child and protecting his job. He knew, just as I did, that in this world, challenging the men in the expensive jumpsuits was a line you didn't cross. The humiliation was ours to swallow, a bitter pill that came with being on the wrong side of the power dynamic in that hangar. The lead engineer didn't even give Leo a second glance. He had already dismissed him, turning back to his team with an air of finality. They started packing up their diagnostic equipment, the metallic clicks of latches and cases echoing the end of the conversation. Their movements were slow, deliberate, a performance for Mr. Davenport that said, "We have done all that can be done. The machine is broken beyond immediate repair." They were retreating into their bubble of corporate protocol and technical excuses, leaving the rest of us to deal with the silent multi-million-dollar monument to their failure. Their confidence in their own wrongness was infuriating. They weren't just wrong, they were proud of being wrong because it was the official conclusion. Mr. Davenport's anger finally erupted. He slammed his phone down on a metal cart, the sound making everyone flinch. "Is this it?" he roared, not at the engineers, but at his pilot, Captain Rostova. "This is the best the manufacturer can do. Fly a team of so-called experts across the country to tell me my jet is a glorified paperweight." His fury needed a target, and it was safer to aim it at his own staff than the representatives of the company that built the plane. Captain Rostova stood her ground, her face impassive, but I could see the strain in her jaw. She was a professional taking the heat for a failure that wasn't hers. The air grew thick with blame, making the hangar feel even smaller, even more suffocating. While the adults were caught in this vortex of anger and blame, Leo had zoned them out completely. He was back by the engine, his head tilted, his expression one of intense concentration. He wasn't looking at the massive turbine anymore. He was listening to something no one else could hear. A faint, almost imperceptible, high-frequency whine. It was the sound of electricity gone astray, a ghost in the machine. He pulled out his worn-out notebook and a pencil, his hands steady now, and began to sketch. Not a drawing of the jet, but a complex wiring. Diagram. His pencil tracing a path of energy he seemed to be seeing in his mind's eye. He was in his own world, a world where machines whispered their secrets. My dad watched him, his own frustration momentarily forgotten. He saw the familiar focus in Leo's eyes, the same look he had when he figured out why the hangar's main hydraulic lift kept failing, a problem that had stumped a certified mechanic for weeks. He saw the certainty in the way Leo's pencil moved across the page, a wave of something, part desperation, part a father's stubborn faith washed over him. He had seen Leo do the impossible before with old generators and farm equipment. Why not with a jet engine? He looked at the defeated engineers, at the fuming billionaire, and then back at his son. In that moment he made a decision. The fear of being fired was suddenly less important than the sting of his son's public humiliation. He walked past the engineers, ignoring their dismissive looks, and stopped directly in front of Mr. Davenport. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't sound desperate. He sounded like a man stating a simple, unbelievable fact. "Mr. Davenport," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "My son, Leo, he says you're all wrong. He says it's not the engine, it's something small, electrical." The entire hangar went quiet. Every eye turned to my father, then to my 10-year-old brother, who was still lost in his schematic, oblivious to the fact that he was now the center of a billionaire's undivided and very skeptical attention. The audacity of my dad's statement hung in the air, thick and heavy. The lead engineer stepped forward, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. "Sir, with all due respect," he began, addressing Davenport but looking at my father with pity, "we are talking about a Pratt & Whitney PW800 series turbine. We have run terabytes of diagnostic data. It's not a loose wire. The boy's father is understandably stressed, but this is a waste of your valuable time." He was trying to frame my dad as an emotional, irrational man, using his technical jargon like a weapon to re-establish his authority. He was painting a picture for Davenport. On one side, a team of experts with data and certifications. On the other, a maintenance worker and his imaginative child. The choice seemed obvious, but desperation does strange things to powerful men. Mr. Davenport had exhausted all his obvious choices. He looked at the smug face of the engineer who had failed him. He looked at the silent, dead engine of his jet. Then he looked over at Leo, who had just looked up from his notebook, his eyes clear and certain, completely unafraid. Davenport was a gambler who had built an empire on calculated risks. This wasn't a calculated risk. It was a shot in the dark, a 1 in a billion long shot. "What have I got to lose?" he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He pointed a finger at Leo. "You, the kid, you have 5 minutes to show me something. 5 minutes or you and your father are out of this hangar for good." The ultimatum hung in the air, a threat and a promise all at once. The engineer's face tightened with indignation, but he said nothing. He had been overruled. My dad gave Leo a slight nod, a silent transfer of trust. Leo didn't seem intimidated by the threat or the attention. He simply walked over to the engine, his notebook in hand. He didn't touch any of the complex diagnostic ports or screens. Instead, he placed his small hand flat against the cold metal of the engine cowling right over the spot he had been staring at. He closed his eyes, shutting out the world of skeptical adults and immense pressure. He was just a boy, listening for that one quiet, discordant note in a symphony of silent, complicated machinery. Everyone watched, holding their breath. It was a bizarre scene. The billionaire, the pilot, the team of elite engineers, all standing by as a 10-year-old boy appeared to be meditating next to a $60 million jet. After a moment, Leo opened his eyes. He didn't speak to Davenport. He turned to the lead engineer, the one who had laughed at him. "It's not the turbine," Leo said, his voice clear and steady. "It's the actuator for the fuel flow regulator, the solenoid. There's a micro-fracture in the ceramic insulator. It doesn't show up on your tests because it only shorts when the initial electrical load hits it. It closes the valve a microsecond too soon." The silence that followed was absolute. The engineer just stared, his mouth slightly open, his professional arrogance finally cracking. The engineer's face went through a rapid series of emotions: shock, disbelief, and finally a deep, professional indignation. He found his voice sputtering at first. That's impossible. The solenoid passed every single diagnostic we ran. A micro-fracture in the ceramic? That's a 1 in a million failure, and it wouldn't present this way. The system has redundancies." For that exact scenario, the FADEC would have flagged it. He was talking to Davenport, but his words were meant to dismantle Leo's credibility, to reassert the dominance of his team's technology over a child's intuition. He was trying to convince everyone, including himself, that what he had just heard was a lucky guess, a flight of fancy from a kid who read too many comic books, not a valid diagnosis of a complex aerospace system. Mr. Davenport, however, had lost all patience for technical excuses and acronyms. He held up a hand, silencing the engineer mid-sentence. His eyes, which had been filled with rage just minutes before, were now sharp with a predatory focus. He looked past the flustered expert and directly at my little brother. "I don't care about your diagnostics anymore," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "They told me I was grounded. He," Davenport gestured with his chin towards Leo, "is telling me there's a chance. I'm not an engineer, but I know a losing hand when I see one and your team is holding it." He then turned his full undivided attention to Leo, the weight of his entire empire seemingly resting on his next question. "Forget him. How do you prove you're right? More importantly, how do you fix it? Right now?" Leo didn't flinch. He looked from Davenport to the engineer, his expression serious. "We can't fix the fracture here, but we can bypass it. There's a manual override procedure for the fuel flow regulator. It's not in the new digital manuals, because they consider it obsolete." He opened his notebook to a page where he had painstakingly redrawn a wiring schematic from memory. "You have to open access panel 7, Charlie, near the base of the pylon. Inside, there's a terminal block. You disconnect the primary lead from the solenoid and reroute it to the auxiliary bus bar. It will bypass the actuator's internal logic and hold the valve open manually during the ignition sequence. It's a temporary fix, but it will get the engine started." He said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, as if explaining how to change a bicycle tire. The lead engineer let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Panel 7. Charlie, that procedure was deprecated 15 years ago. It was from the first edition service manual. It's considered unsafe. We don't carry that documentation, and none of my technicians are certified for that kind of field modification. It's reckless." He looked at Davenport, pleading with him to see reason, to trust the certified process over this fantasy. It felt like a checkmate. The solution was there, but it was locked away in the past, deemed too risky by the very people who were supposed to be the experts. The hope that had flickered in the hangar seemed about to be extinguished by corporate policy and a fear of liability. It was the perfect excuse for them to do nothing, but my dad, who had been standing silently by, took a step forward. His voice was quiet but firm. "He has the manual." All eyes snapped to him. Leo found it. In a box of old documents that were being thrown out last year. He reads it all the time. My dad looked at Leo's worn-out backpack, a simple school bag that suddenly seemed to hold the most important object in the room. In that moment, my father wasn't just a maintenance supervisor. He was the guardian of his son's strange and wonderful gift, and he was placing it on the table for the whole world to see. The engineer's face paled slightly. The excuse he had just used, the one that should have ended the conversation, was about to be proven completely irrelevant. Leo knelt, unzipped his backpack, and pulled out a thick, grease-stained binder. The cover was faded, the title barely legible. Gulfstream G650, Service Manual, First Edition. It looked like an ancient relic next to the engineer's sleek tablets. He didn't need to search for the page. He flipped it open to a well-worn section, the paper soft from being handled so many times. He laid it on a nearby crate. There it was, a complex hand-drawn diagram showing the exact terminal block he had described. An arrow pointed to a specific wire with a note scrawled in the margin. Manual fuel flow override, emergency only. It was real. The proof wasn't on a screen. It was on a yellowed piece of paper, a forgotten piece of knowledge from the machine's own history. The lead engineer stared at the open manual, his face a mask of disbelief and professional horror. He was completely cornered, his expertise and technology rendered useless by a 10-year-old boy and a discarded book. He made one last desperate stand, turning to Mr. Davenport. "Sir, I must advise you in the strongest possible terms not to do this. Performing an unauthorized, non-certified procedure like this will instantly void the manufacturer's warranty on a $20 million engine. If he is wrong, if there's another issue, the resulting damage could be catastrophic. The risk is enormous." He was no longer trying to be right. He was trying to absolve himself of the responsibility for what was about to happen, placing the weight of the decision squarely on Davenport's shoulders. Mr. Davenport stared at the engineer, then at the open manual, and finally his gaze settled on Leo. The billionaire's face was unreadable for a moment, a mask of cold calculation. He had built his empire not by avoiding risk, but by mastering it, by knowing which long shots were worth taking. This was the longest shot of his life, and the stakes were his entire reputation. "Void the warranty," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "The warranty is already void if the plane doesn't fly. Your team offered me a guaranteed failure. This boy," he said, pointing at Leo, "is offering me a chance. I'll take the chance." He looked at the lead engineer, his eyes like ice. "You will do exactly as he says. You will follow his instructions to the letter. If you have a problem with that, your company can send me the bill for a new jet. Now, get to work." The engineer's face turned a shade of pale I'd never seen before. It was the color of pure, unadulterated humiliation. He had been stripped of his authority, his expertise, his entire professional identity, by his own client in front of his team, all on the word of a 10-year-old boy. He slowly picked up a small toolkit, his movements stiff and resentful. He walked towards the engine, not as an expert, but as a reluctant apprentice. Every step he took was heavy with protest. He avoided looking at Leo, instead staring at the open manual as if it were a document sentencing him to professional execution. He wasn't just following orders, he was being forced to participate in what he believed was a reckless act of insanity, and the resentment radiated from him like heat. Leo, however, was completely unfazed by the man's attitude. He was in his element now, the world of circuits and schematics. "You need to open access panel 7, Charlie," he instructed, his voice steady. "It's secured by 4 hex bolts. You'll need a 5mm driver for that." The engineer fumbled for the tool, his pride clearly warring with the direct order he'd been given. Leo continued, pointing to a spot on the engine pylon. "Once you're inside, you'll see a terminal block protected by a clear plastic cover. Be careful when you remove it. The clips are old and can be brittle." He spoke with the calm authority of a seasoned instructor, not a child. The power dynamic in that hangar had been completely inverted. The man with the degrees and certifications was now taking orders from a boy with a library card and a gift for listening. The engineer knelt, his movements precise, but filled with a simmering anger. The sound of the hex driver turning was unnaturally loud in the silent hangar. A moment later, the small metal panel came free, revealing a dense nest of multicolored wires and connectors. It looked like an impossible puzzle. The engineer hesitated, staring into the complex machinery. "The primary lead to the solenoid is the red one with the white stripe," Leo said from behind him, not even needing to look closely. "You need to disconnect it from the main terminal. Then you'll see an auxiliary bus bar to the right. It's usually capped. You need to connect the lead to that." He was describing a procedure he had only ever seen on a piece of paper, yet he spoke with the certainty of someone who had done it 100 times. The engineer reached into the panel, his large hands looking clumsy and out of place amongst the delicate wiring. He located the red and white wire Leo had described. As he tried to detach the connector, it wouldn't budge. He pulled harder, a grunt of frustration escaping him. "It's seized," he muttered, a hint of triumphant failure in his voice. He looked back as if to say, "See, I told you this was a bad idea." But Leo just leaned in closer, squinting. "Stop pulling," he said calmly. "You'll break the terminal. Look at the base of the connector. There's a small locking tab. You have to press it down with a flathead screwdriver while you pull. It's a safety mechanism they stopped using after the first production run." The engineer froze, then slowly reached for a small screwdriver, his last shred of resistance crumbling away. With a soft click, the connector came free. The engineer's shoulders sagged in either relief or defeat. I couldn't tell which. He held the loose wire in his hand, a look of profound disbelief on his face. He followed Leo's final instruction, carefully removing the protective cap from the auxiliary bus bar and sliding the connector into place. It clicked home with a quiet finality. The bypass was complete. The physical act was simple, taking only a few minutes, but the implications were massive. The engineer slowly stood up, backing away from the engine as if it might explode. He wiped a hand across his sweaty brow and looked at Mr. Davenport, then at Leo. He said nothing, but his expression was a cocktail of shock, fear, and a grudging, newfound respect. He had done his part. The rest was out of his hands. Now all the pressure in the room shifted. It flowed away from the defeated engineer and the silent engine and funneled directly into the cockpit, where Captain Rostova sat. She had watched the entire exchange on the small security monitor inside, her face a stoic mask. Mr. Davenport looked up at her, his expression intense. "Captain," he said, his voice echoing in the hangar. "Start it up." Leo looked at her too, and for the first time I saw a flicker of the 10-year-old boy in him. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. Captain Rostova, a pilot trained to trust instruments and protocols above all else, took a deep breath. She had been told this was impossible. She now had to trust a child's intuition over her own extensive experience. Her hand, steady and professional, moved towards the engine start switch. The silence was deafening. For a long, agonizing second, nothing happened. Captain Rostova's finger pressed the engine start button, and the only sound in the vast hangar was the collective intake of breath from everyone watching. I saw the lead engineer's mouth curve into a tiny, almost imperceptible smirk of, "I told you so." It was the longest second of my life. In that silent moment, I saw my dad's shoulders begin to slump, the weight of his gamble finally crashing down on him. He had risked his livelihood on his son's strange talent, and for a terrifying instant it looked like he had lost. The silence wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the sound of failure, cold and absolute, and it was about to swallow us whole. Was this it? Was this the moment my brother's spirit would be broken for good? Then a sound cut through the tension. It wasn't the weak, sputtering cough we had heard before. It was a firm, solid click whine, a sound of pure, unadulterated electrical current finding its intended path. It was the sound of a circuit being completed, of a command being obeyed without hesitation. It was a healthy sound, a confident sound. The lead engineer's smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of confusion. He knew that sound. It was the correct initial engagement sequence, the one their diagnostics had told them was impossible to achieve. The low whine began to climb in pitch, a smooth, steady ascent that spoke of perfectly controlled fuel flow. It was the sound of a machine waking up exactly as it was, designed to, and in that moment, everyone in the hangar knew something fundamental had just shifted. The whine grew, escalating from a high-pitched hum into a deep, resonant growl. It was the sound of the massive turbine fans beginning to spool, catching the air and compressing it with ferocious efficiency. The sound built on itself layer by layer, a symphony of precision engineering coming to life. You could feel the power in the concrete floor beneath our feet, a low vibration that traveled up your legs and settled in your chest. The air itself seemed to tremble, charged with energy. The engineers, who had been standing with their arms crossed in a posture of defiant skepticism, slowly uncrossed them. Their faces, once masks of condescending certainty, were now slack with disbelief. They were witnessing the resurrection of a machine they had already declared dead, and it was defying every piece of data they had. Suddenly, the growl erupted into a full-throated roar. It was a clean, deafening and utterly perfect sound of controlled combustion. The sheer force of it blasted through the hangar, a wave of raw power that made the metal tool carts rattle and the lights flicker. It wasn't just loud, it was the sound of $60 million of machinery working in perfect harmony, a testament to what was possible when someone truly understood its heart. The smell of burnt jet fuel, which had earlier smelled like failure, now smelled like victory. The roar was so absolute, so undeniable, that it seemed to physically push the lead engineer back a step. It was the sound of his entire professional world being turned upside down, and it was the most beautiful noise I had ever heard in my entire life. The lead engineer's face was a canvas of pure, unadulterated shock. His jaw was literally hanging open, his eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on the roaring turbine. All the arrogance, all the condescension, all the professional superiority had been sandblasted away by the sheer force of that sound. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, or worse, a man who had just realized the ghost was real, and he had laughed in its face. He stumbled back another step, his hand coming up to his chest as if to check if his own heart was still beating. He wasn't just proven wrong. He had been fundamentally dismantled. His entire belief system, built on certifications, data, and protocol, had just been rendered meaningless by a 10-year-old boy with a dirty notebook. His humiliation was silent, but it was as loud as the engine itself. Mr. Davenport didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his body rigid, his eyes locked on the engine. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't celebrating. His face was a mask of cold, hard intensity. He was a man who dealt in power, and he had just witnessed a display of it that had nothing to do with money or status. He slowly turned his head, his gaze shifting from the roaring engine to my little brother, Leo. The look in his eyes was something I had never seen before. It wasn't gratitude, it wasn't relief. It was a look of profound, almost frightening recognition. In that moment, he didn't see a child. He saw a key. He saw a unique, priceless asset that had just saved his empire. He saw a form of genius that his money couldn't buy, but that he now desperately needed to control. After a full minute of letting the engine run, a minute that felt like an eternity, Captain Rostover's voice came over the hangar's intercom, crisp and professional. Engine parameters are stable, all green, shutting down. With a final, powerful whoosh, the roar began to subside, spooling down into a whine, then a hum, and finally a heavy, profound silence. The only sound was the faint ticking of the cooling metal. No one spoke. No one moved. The air was thick with the weight of what had just happened. The engineers stood frozen, like statues of defeated men. My dad put his hand on Leo's shoulder, a gesture of immense, unspoken pride. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, the new reality of the hangar settled in. The invisible boy was now the most powerful person in the room. Mr. Davenport finally broke the silence. He walked past the defeated engineers without a glance and stopped directly in front of Leo. He didn't kneel down to his level. He stood over him, a towering figure of immense power, and looked at him, not with warmth, but with a sharp, calculating intensity. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice a low command. "Leo," my brother whispered. Davenport nodded slowly. "Leo," he repeated, as if logging the name into a mental database. "From now on, you have a permanent, all-access pass to this hangar and any other facility I own. I'm establishing a trust for your education. You'll go to any school you want, MIT, Caltech, I don't care. Your father will report directly to me from now on. You don't work for the hangar anymore, you work for me. It wasn't an offer, it was an acquisition. He then turned his attention to the Go team. His voice dropped, becoming dangerously cold. As for you, he said, looking directly at the lead engineer, pack your things. I'm calling your CEO right now to explain how his elite team of experts was outperformed by a 10-year-old with a notebook. I'll be sending him a bill for your travel expenses, along with a recommendation that you be reassigned to a position where your expertise can't cost someone $1 billion deal. You are no longer welcome on my property. Get out. The words were like physical blows. The engineer's face, which had been pale with shock, now flushed with a deep, burning shame. Without a word, he and his team began to pack their expensive equipment, their movements clumsy and defeated under the weight of their public failure. They were ghosts now, being exorcised from a place they once commanded. My dad stood frozen for a moment, his face a complex mix of emotions. I could see the overwhelming pride in his eyes, a father's, pure joy at his son's triumph. But underneath it, there was a new kind of fear. His son was no longer just his boy. He was now an asset to one of the most powerful and ruthless men in the world. Davenport hadn't asked, he had declared. My dad had just lost a degree of control over his own son's future, trading it for a life he could never have provided. He put his hand on Leo's shoulder, a gesture that was both protective and helpless. He looked at Mr. Davenport, and for the first time he wasn't looking at his boss. He was looking at a man who now owned a piece of his son's soul. The victory felt heavy, layered with a price we were only beginning to understand. As the disgraced engineers shuffled out, Captain Rostova descended the jet stairs. She walked directly to Leo, her professional stiffness gone, replaced by a look of genuine awe. She knelt, bringing herself eye to eye with him, a sign of respect no one else had offered. "I've flown for 20 years, she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I've trusted my life to instruments that cost more than a house. I've never seen anything like what you did today. You don't just understand machines, Leo. You listen to them." She reached out and gently tapped his worn-out notebook. "Never stop listening. That's a gift." Coming from her, a woman of impeccable discipline and experience, the words carried more weight than all of Davenport's money. It was an acknowledgement from one professional to another, a validation that went beyond the roaring engine and the high-stakes drama. And Leo, he seemed almost oblivious to the seismic shifts happening around him. While Davenport was dictating his future and the engineers were facing their ruin, Leo had already knelt on the floor and opened his notebook again. He wasn't basking in the glory. He was making a small notation on the schematic he had drawn, a tiny correction only he would understand. He had solved the puzzle. The machine was happy, and for him, that was the end of the story. He looked up at Captain Rostova and gave a small, shy smile. Mr. Davenport saw this, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He understood that he could buy Leo's time and his education, but he could never own the quiet, internal world where the real magic happened. That part of Leo would always be free. That night changed everything. The hangar was never just a workplace again. It became Leo's laboratory. He wasn't the supervisor's weird kid anymore. He was the kid. Legend whispered among pilots and mechanics. My dad had a new boss and a new set of worries, and I learned that sometimes the greatest victories feel strangely like a surrender. Leo went on to those fancy schools, but his real education always came from the grease-stained pages of old manuals and the quiet hum of machines telling him their secrets. He learned to navigate the world of powerful men, but he never lost that rare ability to listen, to hear the one quiet truth that everyone else was too busy, too arrogant, or too loud to notice. If you know someone who has ever been underestimated, who has a quiet talent the world needs to see, please share this story with them. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own power in the most unexpected ways. Thank you for listening. The silence that fell after the engine spooled down was heavier than the roar had been. It was filled with the unspoken truth of what had just happened. Mr. Davenport, a man who commanded industries with a single phone call, stood there, looking not at his saved billion-dollar deal but at my 10-year-old brother. He saw something that day he couldn't buy, a form of genius that didn't follow the rules of his world. And in that moment, he did the only thing a man like him knows how to do. He acquired it. The scholarship, the mentorship, the all-access pass. It wasn't a gift. It was a contract. It was the first time I realized that even the most incredible victories can come with a price tag, one that isn't measured in dollars but in freedom. We had won, but a part of Leo now belonged to that hangar, to that man. That night truly changed everything for our family. My father was no longer just a hangar supervisor. He was the guardian of Davenport's most valuable asset. His job was secure, our lives were financially stable, but there was a new, unspoken tension. He watched Leo with a mixture of immense pride and a quiet, gnawing fear. He had seen his son perform a miracle, and he had also seen him get claimed as a prize. Leo, of course, went on to those prestigious schools, his tuition paid from a trust fund with more zeros than I could count. But his real education never came from a lecture hall. It came from the quiet hours he spent in hangars and workshops, his hands stained with grease, listening to the secrets that machines only whisper to those who truly care to hear them. The greatest lesson from that day wasn't about mechanics or engineering. It was about listening. The Go team had all the data, all the technology, and all the certifications. They had terabytes of information telling them what was happening, but they couldn't hear the truth. They were deafened by their own expertise. Leo, on the other hand, had nothing but his senses and a deep, intuitive empathy for the machine. He heard the one quiet, discordant note in a symphony of complex systems. He proved that in a world obsessed with loud opinions and overwhelming data, the most profound answers are often found in the silence, waiting for someone to simply pay attention. True genius isn't about knowing all the answers. It's about knowing how to listen for the right questions. Watching it all unfold, I learned that a person's worth is never defined by the labels others put on them. To those engineers, Leo was a nuisance. To Davenport, he was initially an inconvenience, then a long shot, and finally, a priceless tool. But to himself, Leo was just a boy who loved engines. He didn't fix that jet to prove a point or to gain a fortune. He did it because the machine was hurting, and he knew how to help. That single-minded purity is a power that arrogance can never defeat and money can never truly own. It taught me to look past the titles, the wealth, and the noise, and to value the quiet competence, the hidden talents, and the simple courage to speak a truth that no one else is willing to hear. If you know someone who has ever been underestimated, who has a quiet talent that the world needs to see, please share this story with them. Sometimes all it takes is one person believing in you to change everything. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own power in the most unexpected of ways, and about the quiet heroes who reshape our world without ever asking for applause. Thank you for listening.